Hi, my name is Francis Conrad, and I help people to live the life that they love. And today on this video, I'm going to talk about something it's really close to home for me because I have been quarantined for weeks. And at times, not all the time, but at times, I can have fears about my own health, or I can have fears about my finances, how we're going to get through this. My business is taking people overseas, traveling, and I can have fears about how do I do my business when we can't even get on a plane and feel safe. So there's so many ways that fears can come up, and that's what I want to talk about today. I want to talk about fear, and my goal is not to make us more afraid. My goal is that hopefully by putting it out there, putting it on the table and looking at it, there might be some things that we gain from this that really benefit us. Now, where do we start? Well, I was thinking a good place to start is how much attention do I give to fear? Like I said, these fears about health and finance and my business, they tend to come and go, but they're not there all the time. And if I catch myself looking at it too much, I can feel the fears growing and getting bigger. So my goal is not only to get off of looking at fear, but my goal is also not to let it grow because I don't like the feeling. The more fearful I get, the more I feel like, I have to do something to protect myself, or I get into all these craziness. So fear, to me, needs to be acknowledged. It's there because it comes and goes. But boy, I don't want it to take over. I want to have a life that is able to let, the fear come and go out the other end, keep going. So as a therapist, I worked as a therapist for 35 years, and so many of my clients came with versions of fear, versions of issues that they really felt like they were stuck in this feeling that it would never get better, there was something wrong with them, and so that became the focus of treatment. Well, probably over the last 20 years working as a therapist, there was a whole set of research that I think relates to this and is very pertinent to what we're dealing with today. Now, originally, when people would come to me and they talked about being a victim, victimization, what I thought immediately was they're talking about horrendous things. They've been really abused, they've been sexually abused, they've had trauma, extreme trauma, and it was obvious to me that that's what we were going to be dealing with. But now, when somebody says victimization, I almost go to the opposite. I go, what is it that may have made this person feel like they weren't good enough? Or how did they feel put down? Or how was it that their life was somehow limited and they were taught that they couldn't do things? All of these small things add up. And that's what polyvictimization is. It's not huge types of victimization, it's small things. And they all come together and add up. And there was a surprise. The research surprised so many of us, it surprised me. And the surprise was that these polyvictimizations, the small forms of victimization, they actually had more of a negative impact on the person than the huge fears, the huge traumas that were obviously traumatic. And I think that that's what happens to all of us. I think that we, in some ways or other, growing up, have been put down, have been limited, have felt that we're not good enough. all the different versions of these small victimizations. And as a result, when we're trying to deal with fear, what's really coming up is that insecurity that we feel from all those so-called small victimizations. But when you put them together, they're not small anymore. When you put them together, it becomes a very fear-based foundation to live from. And that's really why I want to talk more about this today, because the impact is huge. It's huge if we don't watch out what we're doing. So let's look at what are some of the impacts, what are some of the results. Well, we've already looked at the fact that polyvictimization, that these fears can hold us back and can become like a foundation for everything that we do. We make a decision and we're not aware of the fact that part of that decision is to protect us from our fears. Part of that decision might be to really defend ourselves in a situation. And remember what we said before, defend ourselves or hold ourselves back from something that we don't even know if it's real or if it's going to happen. Remember, fear is not a very good predictor. So besides having this foundation of fear, the other thing that can happen is what we call ego. Now, think about what ego is, and it's interesting. Ego is the part of me that is needing to protect myself. It's the part of me that feels separate, feels alone, and so I have to live my own life and do my best to create a life that's filled with, create a life that really represents me to the public. Because why? Because behind this representation, behind wanting to do it and come across well, behind all that is fear. And it may not even be conscious, but at some level, that foundation that we talked about, it's inside of us. And it's almost like as if until we're aware that it's there, it remains sort of like hidden, but it's involved in all of our ego. It's involved in all of that sense of that we're separate and that we're not good enough. Maybe a third thing goes back to some research that was done during World War II. When soldiers came home from the war, there were a few of them that even though they were home, a car could backfire and they would hit the floor because to them it was a bomb. They could walk in the dark and be ready, suspicious that somebody could jump out at them from any place unseen, you know. And we called that PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. And the idea was these guys came home from the war, and not only did they come home, but it was like the war came back with them. The war was over, and these guys were still experiencing life as if the war were still going on. So what PTSD does is it brings our past into the future, into the present, and the war is no longer gone. You could say the same thing about victimization, that the person's abuse is still being experienced even though it happened 30 years ago. So we can grab onto our past and bring it into the present as if it's still going on. We can identify with the messages that we're not good enough and we don't belong and we can't do it, and make that so much a part of our ego identity. And we can just be impacted so much that it's like an invisible foundation to everything that we do. Now, that's a pretty bleak story, but maybe at the level of fear, when we start to approach and want to acknowledge the fear in our lives, the best place to look is, where inside do I have this sense that I'm not good enough, that I can't do it? And below that, a foundation that says no matter what you do, you've got to watch out, you're separate, you're never going to make it. That's the ego speaking, and it's speaking from that place that it's so familiar with. The ego boundaries are made up of fear. So how do we maintain fear? Here we have these foundations that tell us that we're not good enough, and they stay with us for a lifetime. How do we maintain that? How do we keep it so that it doesn't go away? And that's pretty easy. We do it with stories. So let me tell you how my family created stories that reinforced fear. My mother used to talk a lot about, we grew up in the suburbs of Cleveland, that if we were to go into the inner city, there were all these things that could happen, so many ways that we would have to be afraid. And the best thing is just avoid it and never go in the inner city because the fears are too great. Now, at the same time, my father was in World War II. And when we talked about Europe, maybe 30 years after the war was over, my father was still holding on to a Europe that was in his experience when he was a soldier in World War II. And it hadn't changed. It was still the same Europe. It's like, no, life has gone on. But for my father, it hadn't, at least not with Europe. For my mother, her predictions about the city, even though they were mostly grossly inadequate, they were real for her. So you see, we kept that fear alive by justifying it and telling stories that would reinforce the fact that the city was not safe, or the fact that Europe represents a time in our history that was horrible. I remember once I was at a workshop, and the guy leading the workshop at that point was a black belt in a martial art that came from China. And he was teaching us a lot of the inner experience of what it is like to really appreciate the martial arts at a very deep level, actually at a spiritual level. And what he told us, that it struck me, you know, I never want to forget it. He said, you know, when you're a martial artist, you go on the mat. And when you're on the mat, you compete and show what you're capable of. And you have somebody else in his mind who's not an opponent, but there's somebody that you're interacting with. And so basically he said, if you are afraid, even to the slightest degree, at the highest levels of martial arts, when you're afraid and you step on that mat, you've already lost. That fear is enough to destroy what it is that you're capable of. And the person who's on the other side is without question going to win. Fear has that much of an impact. It can stop us from performing at our best. Now I'm thinking, isn't this true of all of life? How can I perform at my best if I have fear going on? How can I step on life's mat, you know, and get out there and not be impacted by something like fear? And so obviously there's a huge concern here because of the impact that fear can have on my life. So the solution, now we're getting to the good part. I told you we're not going to just stay stuck on the negative. The solution to this, how do I resolve this? Well, my suggestion, quite simply, is if we reinforce our fears with stories, let's tell new stories. Let's change the story. Let's create a new future with new storytelling. So instead of those stories that my mother told about the inner city or my father told about Europe, let's tell new stories. Let's invent stories. What kind of stories would have an impact that would really be most beneficial? And I came up with a very simple plan. What if the stories I tell were designed to move me away from being constricted by fear, being limited by fear, into greatness? Tell stories about what is possible when I'm functioning at my best, when I am my greatest, and when I'm doing things that I'm really excelling. I cannot have that attitude and that experience and have fear at the same time. So I replace my fear and my smallness and my constriction by expanding out, opening up, and telling stories of greatness and what is possible and how things can resolve. That's my first thing. Take smallness and expand it to your greatness in stories. Since it's stories that have been used to constrict us, stories will free us. And then another way to look at the very same thing is I could inspire myself to live my dreams. So make your dreams huge. Make your dreams great. Make your dreams almost impossible to accomplish. And really allow yourself to look into those dreams as who you really are. Because we're capable of so much more. If we can't predict the future with fear, then why not predict the future with these kinds of dreams that really represent us at our best? So inspire yourself with big dreams and change constricting smallness and fears into greatness. Two types of stories that I think could have a tremendous impact. So I'd like to end by bringing this all together. As a therapist for 10 years, I worked with juveniles. They were called juvenile delinquents, and they were in front of the judge every week because of problems with fights, problems in school, difficulty with substance abuse, all the different types of reasons that kids could get in trouble. These kids did them and more. And so they ended up being detained. And then in detention, if they acted out, guess what? Their detention was extended. So sometimes they could be detained for long periods of time. And when they finally got out, I could meet with them and we could look at what's really important to you. And there was no doubt, after being detained and restricted for so long, they wanted their freedom. They wanted to be able to really feel like they could be expansive and do things again. And I think that maybe that's a metaphor which applies to the coronavirus and those of us who have been quarantined. We've been detained, and we look forward to the day when we can have our freedom. I know for me, when this is over, what freedom means to me is I can't wait. I've been really bottled up and restricted from travel. It makes me even want to appreciate travel more. Travel to me represents being expansive and being able to experience more and more. So, and I know there's a lot of people like me out there that when we are restricted, travel is like the perfect solution. But there's other perfect solutions. So my question at the end of this video, what is it that represents your best expansive freedom when you're let free from your quarantine? Not talking about being unsafe, but I'm talking about when things are safe again, and we can do whatever it is that we want. What would you like to do? What could you dream about that might really represent you at your best? So if we go back and just review, we talked about fear, and that fear is not a good predictor of the future. And not only that, but how we can use stories that even frighten us and scare us more and make us feel worse and constrict us. And the power then of being able to take that constriction and that smallness and to create stories of expansion, which allow us to feel like we're representing who we are at our best. And in the end, like the kids who have been detained, this has been a time when we get to really think about, what would I like to do with my freedom when I can get out of this quarantine? How can I expand my life in a way that really feels like it represents me at my very best? So I hope that all of you guys have a chance to, live the life you love and do more of it and be freer to do it as a result of telling stories that really represent who you are at your best. Thank you for this opportunity to share some ideas on fear.